The policy of the sanctions against Saddam has not worked. He's getting $3 billion a year from smuggling trade that's coming in from Turkey, that's coming in from Jordan, that's coming in from Syria.
And coming in from Halliburton not long ago.
Well, not back in the 80s, it was coming in from Halliburton, no question about it, maybe even into the 90s. You have the policy of deterrence that supposedly worked so well during that. Look, I have a son-in-law who's just written a new book about the dangers of Iraq. He's one of this country's leading Iraq experts. One of the things he points out in his book that I did not know, I must confess, is that deterrence against Saddam Hussein didn't work. We went to Saddam, when I say we, Secretary of State Jim Baker went to Saddam, or Saddam's people, and said, if you use weapons of mass destruction against U.S. troops, we will, and the implication was we might use tactical nuclear weapons against Iraq. If you set fire to the oil fields in Kuwait, we may use weapons of mass destruction against you. If you fire weapons against the Israelis, we may use weapons of mass destruction against you. He did 2 out of 3. And the fact of the matter is, apparently he had left orders that if U.S. troops were going to keep marching toward Baghdad, that if they got within, I forget what the distance was, 50 miles or so, that they would use weapons of mass destruction against U.S. troops. Deterrence didn't work. Now, what are you going to do with a guy like Saddam if, in fact, he ever gets a nuclear device? I don't happen to believe, Phil, that he would use it against us directly. But what if he explodes one nuclear device in the Saudi oil fields? It would destroy the Saudi oil fields for the next 20 years. It would throw the world into a depression, the likes of which it hasn't seen in 60 years.
What if, what if, what if?
Well, of course, what if?
Well, about how many countries are you willing to say, what if? He's not alone out there with the potential for nuclear destruction. And you're going to have the world with a front row seat to the most powerful nation on earth dropping bombs? What? Invading the city of Iraq, which has already lost more than 500,000 babies, infants, because of the infrastructure that's been contaminated and ruined by our bombing, which is now about a decade long.
Well, wait a second, Phil. I mean, A, first of all, I said I can make the argument either way. But B, I think before you say that the 500,000 babies and
UN,
others who died...
Madeleine Albright signed off on that number.
I understand. The number, but not the cause. I don't think Madeleine Albright conceded that the cause of 500,000 Iraqi people and children dying was because of the United States. I think she would at least have made the argument, if she didn't make it, and I'd be very surprised if she didn't, that Saddam Hussein had something to do with withholding from his people the money that he was making from the oil that he has been selling.
Right.
You know, I mean, he's been making $3 billion a year for the last few years. If he's all that concerned about feeding his people and making sure they get medicine, why isn't he giving it to them?
Why, you were in Baghdad. This is 1990. You're in Baghdad reporting 2 weeks after the invasion. Watch this.
Good evening. I'm Ted Koppel reporting from Baghdad, Iraq, and this is Nightline. We are the first U.S. journalists allowed into this country since the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait almost 2 weeks ago, and what we have found will be the focus of this broadcast tonight.
Are you going to go back? And were you thrown out the last time?
I was invited out the last time.
You were invited out?
I was invited out.
Well, I hope you're going to cover it this time.
I'm going to cover it.
Well, ABC News will cover it?
Oh, ABC News will cover it.
Will it be on the ground?
I sincerely hope so. I'm going to try.
And the Pentagon's going to say, no, no. You journalists, nobody likes you anyway. The Pentagon's going to say, out of here, and you're going to pick up your suitcase and all your television equipment and satellites, and you're going to leave.
The Pentagon did that the last time. The Pentagon did that in large measure during Operation Desert Storm.
And there was a meek response, I thought, from the American media.
I mean, I must tell you, my old friend Forrest Sawyer, who I think appears on this network with some frequency. Forrest Sawyer,
very good reporter.
Very good reporter. Got in, went in with the Egyptians. I couldn't get there with the American army, but got there with the Egyptian army, and he was one of the first people into Kuwait. You know, there's more than one way to get into Iraq. I hope and pray that The Pentagon will see the wisdom of bringing along reporters and of cooperating with reporters. Do I think it's very likely, given the track record of this administration? No, I don't. But I hope they do.
The Pentagon says, get behind the rope. You know, you watch.
You got video phones. You use them?
Probably not.
Knowing full well that people in Baghdad are watching.
Probably not.
All right. You wouldn't. I wouldn't. Are you sure that everybody won't?
Well, but if you're, you know, if a questioning of Ariel Sharon.
Aggressive. I'm as gentle as a lamb compared to you.
Well, as a matter of fact, have not the Israelis gotten a pass from American media? Is there not a bias that somehow is built into American media, fearful of criticizing? You're smiling because you've heard the question before.
No,
Tell me why it's not an important question.
I'm smiling because you're nothing if not flexible. You start off telling me how tough I am, and boom, already I'm one of the lambs who's going along with everything the Israelis are doing.
You know, you don't see the Prime Minister pushed like that by American reporters.
I think the Israelis, Tom Friedman had a very interesting piece in the Times this morning, I'm sure you saw it, in which he was talking about his sense of outrage that the Israelis are being pushed by a totally different standard. We don't use that standard to push the Syrians, we don't use that standard to push the Lebanese, we don't use that standard to push any one of the countries surrounding Israel. I think to a large extent the Israelis deserve tough questions. But I don't think they deserve to be treated like enemies of the United States. They are anything but that.
Well, but they certainly deserve to be treated aggressively by the world press.
They deserve to be asked tough questions, and as you were kind enough to do, I try to do.
It was a tough one.
I try to
see with Ted Koppel. Once more from your book, Off Camera. You write, and this is 1999, I have the uneasy feeling that a few decades from now, people will look back on this year and say, oh yes, 99, that was one of the last pre-war years. That is so grim, Ted Koppel. Are we truly headed to a substantial first part of this century where will our grandchildren be waking up wondering, when they're adults, wondering what color is today's alert? Do you feel the same way today as when you wrote that?
I mean, actually, today it's a lot easier to say that than it was back in 1999.
Today, you could almost say, well, I was right.
I still hope I'm not right, but this notion that the war against terrorism is something, and the President has said as much, that the war against terrorism is something that can be concluded, that can be won in a few months or a few years, that would be an illusion. We are undergoing right now here in Washington terrorism by one man, maybe two men. And it's terrorism of a kind that shows how few resources are required to throw a community of about 1 million people, if you talk about the greater Washington area, into a panic.
Yeah.
The danger of terrorism is it doesn't require many people. It doesn't require weapons of mass destruction.
Right.
It requires one man or woman willing to strap explosives around their waist and walk into a bar.
Yes.
That's all it needs.
Right. And is the answer to that problem bombing one of the poorest nations on earth from the air, knocking off Saddam when you have, this president has offered no proof that there's a connection between Saddam and 9/11. None. You know, and now Bali, the island of Bali just went up.
You asked a question.
And I'm afraid you're not going to have enough time to answer it, so sorry. I don't want to give you a long pass.
It's a hell of a program you got
I know.
here.
I just love listening to myself speak. Well, go ahead, start it. We have 30 seconds. I'm sorry. I thought you were going to get in the middle of that. Launch your case here, and then we'll finish it when we come back.
All I'm saying is that getting rid of Saddam may be part of the answer to that question, because if you get rid of Saddam, you engage in an object lesson that will be seen and heard in places like Syria, in places like North Korea, in places like Iran. There is a message here also.
Yeah. We're always sending messages to Saddam Hussein. We've been sending messages now for over 10 years. 3 presidents. We'll talk about these messages when we come back with Ted Koppel in just a moment.